The guards at Camp Ashford stopped counting prisoners during the blizzard of February 9, 1943. When the storm cleared 3 days later, they discovered prisoner 4,782 had simply walked into the white. What they didn't know was that he'd been planning it for months. Before we dive into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today and what time is it right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. Camp Ashford sat in the hill country of eastern Tennessee, established in 1942 to house German prisoners captured in North Africa. The facility held 347 men behind chain link and watchtowers, most of them ordinary soldiers who'd surrendered without incident. They worked lumber details during the day, returned to barracks at night, and waited for a war to end that seemed increasingly distant from their daily routines. Prisoner 4,782 arrived in January of that year. Records identified him only as H. Brenner, rank unknown, captured near Kasserine Pass. The intake officer noted unusual scarring on his hands and forearms, marks that suggested burns or chemical exposure. Brenner spoke little, worked efficiently, and never caused problems. His file contained a single disciplinary note for hoarding food scraps in his footlocker. The camp commander had reduced guard rotations that winter due to budget constraints and the assumption that escape attempts would be suicide in the mountain cold. Most prisoners understood this. Brenner understood it differently. He'd been stealing extra clothing for weeks, layer by layer, hiding wool and canvas beneath his bunk. He studied the guard patterns, memorized shift changes, noted the blind spots in the tower sightlines. On February 9th, a storm system moved through the valley that meteorologists later classified as the worst blizzard in Tennessee history. Visibility dropped to 0 within minutes. The work detail was cutting timber 2 miles from camp when the wind made it impossible to see the man standing next to you. Brenner waited until the guard had turned his back, then walked directly into the white curtain of snow. By the time they realized he was missing, his footprints had already been erased by fresh powder. The camp commander made the calculation that most officers would have made. A man on foot in that storm, without proper supplies or knowledge of the terrain, would be dead within hours. They'd find the body when the snow melted. It wasn't worth risking men to search. They filed the incident report and marked prisoner 4,782 as deceased. The paperwork went to Washington and disappeared into filing cabinets where thousands of other wartime deaths were cataloged and forgotten. Nobody questioned it. Nobody followed up. And nobody knew that Brenner had grown up in the Bavarian Alps, where winters made Tennessee look mild, where he'd learned to survive conditions that would kill softer men. He was already 5 miles into the wilderness when they stopped looking for him. The Osterfeld family had lived in Copper Hollow since 1921, when Ernst and Greta arrived from Hamburg with nothing but 2 suitcases and a land deed purchased through a Pittsburgh immigration broker. The hollow sat deep in the Appalachian Range, accessible only by a logging road that became impassable each winter. Their nearest neighbor lived 11 miles south, a distance that meant complete isolation from November through March. Ernst had built the cabin himself over 2 years, using timber from his own land. County records show he registered the property properly, paid his taxes on time, and made his required supply runs to the general store in Millbrook each autumn. He was known as a quiet man, competent with tools and solitary by preference. His English remained heavily accented even after 2 decades, which made him unpopular during the war years. But his isolation meant he rarely encountered the hostility that other German immigrants faced. Greta kept a garden that locals considered remarkable for the altitude and harsh soil. She preserved vegetables in the cellar, kept chickens in a reinforced coop, and maintained a smokehouse where Ernst hung venison and wild turkey. Their self-sufficiency was born of necessity, not choice. In winter, they were entirely cut off from civilization. The children had been born in the hollow. Wilhelm, 14, had never attended school, but could read 3 languages from his mother's teaching. Anna, 11, helped with the gardening and showed talent for drawing, filling notebooks with sketches of the mountains and wildlife. The youngest, Johann, was 7 and small for his age. Often sick during the coldest months, but resilient in the way that children raised hard must become. The postal carrier made his last delivery to their box on November 20th, 1942. Ernst collected it on the 23rd, along with his final supply load from Millbrook. The storekeeper remembered him buying extra flour, salt pork, and lamp oil. More than usual, he'd noted, but didn't think much of it. The Osterfelds always prepared carefully for winter. By January, the family had settled into their seasonal routine. Wilhelm checked the trap lines each morning, bringing back rabbit and squirrel to supplement their stores. Ernst split firewood and maintained the cabin against the brutal cold. Greta taught the younger children their lessons by lamplight, while wind screamed through the mountain passes. They had no radio, no telephone, no way of knowing that a German prisoner had escaped from Camp Ashford, or that he was moving through the mountains in their direction. Even if they'd known, they wouldn't have been able to leave. The snow had already buried the logging road under 6 feet of powder. The last written record of the family comes from Ernst's unfinished letter, discovered later on the cabin table. He'd been writing to his sister in Pennsylvania, describing the harsh winter and mentioning that Wilhelm had become an excellent trapper. The letter ended mid-sentence, the pen still resting in the fold of the paper. Investigators determined it had been written on February 17th. On February 21st, the postal carrier noticed their box remained full from his previous delivery. By February 28th, he reported this to the sheriff, expressing concern given the family's consistent habits. The sheriff promised to check on them once the roads cleared. The roads wouldn't clear until mid-March. By then, the Osterfeld cabin had been occupied by someone else for nearly a month. The chickens were gone. The smokehouse had been emptied and refilled, and the cellar contained things that would require a sealed evidence designation for the next 40 years. Brenner's diary was recovered from the cabin in March, written in cramped German script across pages torn from a military logbook he'd carried from Camp Ashford. The early entries documented his escape with clinical precision, noting distances traveled, shelters found, and the gradual failure of his stolen supplies. February 10th. Made 8 kilometers northeast. Found abandoned hunting shelter. Roof intact. Temperature dropping severely after dark. Consumed last of the bread. Snow continues. February 11th. No movement possible. Storm intensified. Trapped in shelter. Melted snow for water. Ate leather from boot tongue. Thought of Munich. Thought of warm bakeries on Marienplatz. The handwriting remained steady through these entries, controlled and methodical. But by the 13th, something had shifted. The precision fractured. Words began running together, sentences losing structure. Cannot feel feet anymore. Stripped bark from pine trees, boiled it. Tastes like nothing. Everything tastes like nothing. Saw Mother today standing in the snow. She wore her blue dress from before the war. When I approached, she became a tree stump. The cold makes ghosts of everything. Sheriff's investigators later traced his route using these entries and the physical evidence he left behind. He'd moved roughly northeast from Camp Ashford, staying close to ridge lines, where the wind kept snow depth manageable. He sheltered in rock overhangs, burned green wood that produced more smoke than heat, and slowly starved. By February 15th, the diary entries had become conversations. Not with himself, but with people who weren't there. His mother, his commanding officer, a girl named Elise, who he'd known in Bavaria. The responses were written in different handwriting, as though he'd used his left hand to create the illusion of dialogue. "Why did you leave me?" the Elise entries asked. "Because the war required it," Brenner responded. "But you survived the war, you survived Africa, you survived the camp, and now you'll die alone in these mountains because you were too proud to stay imprisoned." The entries after this became difficult to read, not because of the handwriting, but because of what they described. Brenner had begun eating things that humans don't eat. Pine needles, insects found dormant under bark, something he identified only as the gray meat from the dead thing in the ravine. On February 17th, his diary recorded the moment that changed everything. Smell on the wind today. Not pine, not snow. Wood smoke. Cooked food. Meat. Followed it northeast for 3 hours. Found valley. Found smoke rising from trees. Someone lives there. Someone who has food and warmth and doesn't know I exist. The entry that followed was a single line, underlined twice. "I will not die in these mountains." He spent the next 2 days watching the cabin from the tree line. His diary documented the family's routines with military precision. The boy who left each morning to check traps. The father who split wood behind the cabin. The mother and younger children who appeared briefly at windows. He counted them, noted their sizes, observed their vulnerabilities. February 19th. 5 people. Isolated. No nearby structures visible. Father carries axe, but no rifle seen today. Boy travels alone into forest. They don't expect danger. Why would they? They believe themselves safe in their mountains. The final entry before everything changed was dated February 20th. "Tomorrow I approach the boy. Tomorrow I stop being hungry. I have not forgotten what must be done to survive. The war taught me this. Africa taught me this. These mountains have taught me this. Survival requires sacrifices. Sometimes those sacrifices belong to other people." Wilhelm Osterfeld left the cabin at dawn on February 21st, carrying his father's skinning knife and a canvas sack for whatever the traps had caught. He followed the same route he'd walked every morning since November, a circuit through the pines that took roughly 3 hours to complete. His father had taught him to be methodical, to check each trap carefully, to reset those that had been sprung by weather or scavengers. Brenner's diary described watching the boy from a position 30 meters upslope, concealed behind a fallen hemlock. He'd been there since before first light, having spent the night in the open, despite temperatures well below freezing. His desperation had moved beyond physical discomfort into something colder and more focused. "The boy moves with confidence," the diary recorded. "He doesn't check behind himself, doesn't expect threats. I have chosen the 4th trap location. Dense cover, far from the cabin. It will take hours before anyone notices his absence." The medical examiner's report, declassified decades later, noted that Wilhelm's body showed evidence of a struggle, but a brief one. The positioning of certain injuries suggested he'd been caught from behind, that the encounter had been swift. The knife found at the scene belonged to the Osterfeld family. Brenner had taken nothing with him that could be traced back to the encounter. The diary entry for that day contained only 3 sentences. "It is done. I feel nothing about it. The meat will keep in this cold." What investigators discovered later, through careful examination of the timeline and physical evidence, suggested Brenner had remained at that location for most of the day. He'd built no fire, left minimal traces. The snow helped him, covering his tracks even as he worked to prepare what he'd taken. The trap circuit wasn't visible from the Osterfeld cabin. Ernst wouldn't have been able to see that his son never completed his rounds. When Wilhelm didn't return by afternoon, the family likely assumed he'd found something worth pursuing, perhaps a deer that needed tracking. It wouldn't have seemed unusual. Not yet. Brenner's next entry appeared 12 hours later, written by firelight, in a small cave he'd located half a mile from the scene. "Strength returning. Can think clearly again. The madness of starvation lifts like fog. I remember who I was before the hunger. Remember my training. Remember that survival is not shameful. The boy was unlucky. I was desperate. These things happen in war, and this is war. My war against the mountains and the cold and the certainty of death." The entry continued, becoming more detailed, more disturbing. He described the taste, compared it to other meats, noted which parts were most sustaining. Then, at the bottom of the page, a realization. "There are 4 more. The family will search for the boy eventually. They will find nothing, I made certain of this, but they will know something is wrong. They will be afraid. Fear makes people careless. Fear makes them vulnerable. I have the boy's knife now. I have his sack. I have strength I didn't have yesterday. And I know where they sleep." The final line was written in heavier script, pressed deep into the paper. "I will not return to that camp. I will not surrender. These mountains will not claim me. But someone must pay the price of my survival, and I have already decided who that will be." When Ernst Osterfeld finally went looking for his son the next morning, tracking his route through the circuit, he found the 4th trap empty and undisturbed. Found no blood, no signs of struggle, nothing to suggest where Wilhelm had gone. The snow had done its work. By the time Ernst returned to the cabin to organize a proper search, Brenner was already watching from the trees, planning his next move. The diary entries between February 22nd and 28th revealed a transformation. Brenner's writing shifted from the fractured desperation of a starving man to something methodical and controlled. He was thinking clearly again. Planning. The military training that had made him valuable in North Africa reasserted itself, but toward a purpose that would have horrified his former commanders. He cataloged the family's patterns with the precision of a reconnaissance officer. The mother appeared at the kitchen window each morning at 7. The father checked the woodpile twice daily, morning and evening. The younger children rarely ventured outside, kept indoors by their mother's caution and the brutal cold. These observations filled page after page, written in tight columns, with times noted to the quarter hour. They search for the boy, but find nothing. One entry noted, "The father grows more desperate, walks farther each day." The mother watches from the window, her face pressed to the glass. "They don't know I'm here. Don't know I've been circling their cabin like a wolf circles injured prey." Court documents from the subsequent military tribunal included psychiatric evaluation of these diary pages. The psychiatrist noted that Brenner demonstrated clear premeditation and tactical planning, contradicting any potential claim of temporary insanity. He was rational, simply willing to do what others wouldn't. February 24th brought a detailed sketch of the cabin's layout, drawn from memory after Brenner had crept close enough during the night to peer through gaps in the shutters. He mapped the sleeping arrangements, noted where the food was stored, identified which floorboards creaked. The sketch included arrows showing sight lines and approach vectors, military annotations in the margins. Weapon assessment, he wrote beneath the drawing. Father has axe, keeps it near door. Kitchen knives visible on counter. No firearms observed inside structure. Children are not threats. Mother is not a threat. Father is the only variable that requires management. The phrase requires management appeared frequently in subsequent entries, always in reference to Ernst. Brenner understood that everything depended on neutralizing the one person capable of physical resistance. He studied Ernst's routines, looking for the moment of maximum vulnerability. On February 26th, he found it. Father walks to woodshed every evening at dusk, carries lantern in left hand, axe in right, returns with armload of wood, cannot defend himself while carrying load. 20 meters from cabin to shed. Shed blocks line of sight from cabin windows for approximately 8 seconds during return journey. This is the opportunity. But Brenner didn't act immediately. The diary shows he waited. Watching 2 more cycles of Ernst's evening routine to confirm the pattern held consistent. He tested the ground between the tree line and the shed, memorizing every root and depression that might cause him to stumble. He located a heavy branch that would serve his purpose, cached it within reach of his approach path. The entry for February 27th contained a timeline written in military format. 1800 hours. Father exits cabin for evening wood collection. 1802. Father reaches woodshed, sets down lantern, begins selecting logs. 1804. Father loads arms with wood, picks up axe in right hand, lantern in left. 1805. Father begins return to cabin. 1806. Opportunity window opens. 1807. Window closes. Father enters cabin. Beneath this timeline, a single sentence. Tomorrow, at 1806, Ernst Osterfeld will stop being a problem. Then the cabin and everything in it belongs to me. The woman speaks German. The children will be too frightened to resist. I will finally be warm again. Ernst Osterfeld's final letter sat on the cabin table, the ink still dark where his pen had stopped mid-word. He'd been writing to his sister in Pennsylvania, trying to explain Wilhelm's disappearance in a way that wouldn't cause her to worry excessively. The letter mentioned hearing wolves at night, unusually close to the cabin. He planned to take his rifle out the next morning to investigate. But Ernst never finished that letter, and he never retrieved his rifle from where it hung above the door. The medical examiner's report, sealed until 1987, documented injuries inconsistent with any animal attack. The fracture pattern to the skull suggested a single massive blow from behind, delivered with enough force to indicate premeditation rather than panic. The weapon was never recovered, though wood splinters found in the wound matched the type of hardwood common to the area. Brenner's diary entry for February 28th was brief, 1806, executed as planned. He never heard me approach. The lantern fell and extinguished, took the axe and his coat, left him between the shed and tree line where the snow is deepest. The family heard nothing. Inside the cabin, the children are singing something in German. What followed was more disturbing than the act itself. Brenner didn't immediately enter the cabin. He waited in the darkness beyond the window light, watching Greta move through the kitchen, preparing the evening meal. Watched her glance toward the door, expecting her husband's return. Watched her expression shift from mild concern to confusion as minutes passed. And Ernst didn't appear. She called his name twice from the doorway, her voice carrying across the clearing. Brenner noted this in his diary with clinical detachment. She suspects something wrong, but will not investigate in darkness. She has children to protect. She will bar the door and wait until morning. This gives me time. He spent that night in the woodshed, wrapped in Ernst's coat, feeding small pieces of firewood into Ernst's lantern. The rifle was there, leaning against the wall where Ernst had left it that morning. Brenner examined it, found it loaded, and added a note to his diary. Now I have proper weapon. Tomorrow I make entry. Woman will not resist once she understands her situation. She is practical. She is German. She will recognize necessity when I explain it. Inside the cabin, Greta had indeed barred the door. She'd gathered the children close and tried to explain their father's absence in ways that wouldn't terrify them. Perhaps he'd fallen and injured himself in the darkness. Perhaps he'd pursued the wolves he'd mentioned in his letter. They would search at first light. But when dawn came on March 1st, it wasn't Greta who opened the door. Brenner had approached during the last hour before sunrise, had knocked in a pattern that might have been Ernst returning. When Greta called out asking for confirmation, Brenner responded in German. "Your husband needs help. He's injured near the tree line. I found him while checking my own traps. You must come quickly." The voice speaking German, the urgency, the appeal to immediate action, all of it was calculated. The door opened. Brenner stepped across the threshold with Ernst's rifle leveled at chest height. Behind Greta, the two younger children stood frozen in their nightclothes. The diary entry for this moment contained just 2 lines. She understood immediately. Didn't scream. Didn't fight. Just stepped backward and asked me in German not to hurt her children. I told her that depended entirely on her cooperation. Then I closed the door behind me, and finally, after 3 weeks in the cold, I was warm. The evidence logs from the March investigation documented a cabin that appeared almost normal at first glance. Dishes stacked neatly by the wash basin. Beds made with military precision. Children's drawings still pinned to the walls. But the investigators who spent more than an hour inside required psychological counseling afterward, and their detailed reports remained sealed for 40 years. Brenner's diary entries from early March revealed the domestic horror he'd constructed. He'd established rules immediately, explained them to Greta in German, while the children listened in terrified silence. Everyone would continue their normal routines. The children would do their lessons. Greta would cook meals. They would speak only German in his presence. Any attempt to escape or signal for help would result in immediate consequences. "The woman is intelligent," he wrote on March 2nd. "She understands her children's lives depend on her obedience. She asked me where Ernst is. I told her he's buried where the snow is deepest." She didn't cry, just nodded and began preparing breakfast. He slept in Ernst's bed, kept the rifle within reach at all times, and rationed the family's food supplies with mathematical precision. His diary included calculations of how long the stores would last, which items to consume first, how to stretch their resources until the spring thaw made escape possible. But the calculations revealed something darker. He wasn't planning to leave. He was planning to sustain himself indefinitely. The younger boy, Johann, became sick on March 5th, fever and coughing that worsened over 2 days. Greta begged Brenner to allow her to take the child to town for medical care. His response was documented in matter-of-fact prose. "The boy is weak. has always been weak according to the mother. In the mountains, the weak don't survive. This is natural law. I told her to keep him quiet and warm. If he recovers, he recovers. If not, the food will last longer. Johann's condition deteriorated. Brenner moved him to the cellar, where his coughing wouldn't disturb the household routine. Greta was permitted to bring him water and blankets, but nothing more. The diary entry for March 8th noted simply that the boy had stopped making noise. Anna, the 11-year-old daughter, tried to run on March 10th. She'd waited until Brenner was occupied with splitting wood, had slipped out the back window, and made it nearly a quarter mile before he tracked her down in the snow. The diary described dragging her back to the cabin, her feet leaving continuous marks where she'd struggled. What happened after that was documented only through physical evidence found later, marks on the cellar door that suggested it had been barred from outside. Greta stopped speaking after that day, even in German. She moved through the cabin like a ghost, cooking when ordered, cleaning mechanically, her eyes fixed on nothing. Brenner noted this change with clinical interest. The woman has given up. She performs tasks but no longer asks questions or makes requests. This is preferable. Less complicated. The girl in the cellar has also become quiet. The cabin feels peaceful now, almost like a real home. He began writing letters to his mother, though he couldn't mail them. Long, detailed accounts of his days, describing the cabin as if he'd always lived there, referring to Greta as his housekeeper and the children as temporary guests. The handwriting in these letters was neat and controlled, completely divorced from the reality they described. On March 14th, he made his first use of the smokehouse. The diary didn't specify what he was preserving, but the dimensions he recorded matched nothing in the family's remaining livestock. Investigators would later determine the smokehouse had been used multiple times during his occupation, the ashes showing evidence of sustained burning at specific temperatures used for meat preservation. The postal inspector made his February visit to the Osterfeld mailbox on the 28th, the same day Ernst disappeared. He noted the box remained full, letters dating back 3 weeks accumulating inside. This matched what he'd reported to the sheriff earlier, but now the situation had crossed from concerning to alarming. No family in these mountains ignored their mail for an entire month. Sheriff Clayton Vance promised to investigate once the logging road became passable. The snow had been relentless that winter, and even his truck with chains couldn't make it beyond the 5-mile marker. He filed the postal inspector's report and waited for the thaw that always came in mid-March. By March 15th, enough snow had melted to attempt the journey. Sheriff Vance and Deputy Frank Hollister left town at dawn, carrying emergency supplies and a stretcher in case they found the family injured or sick. The drive took 4 hours over roads that were more mud than gravel, the truck sliding dangerously close to the ravine edge twice before they reached Copper Hollow. Smoke rose from the cabin chimney. This was the first thing Vance noted in his official report. The family was clearly alive, clearly active. Relief flooded through both men as they approached the clearing. Whatever had prevented the Osterfelds from collecting their mail, it hadn't been a disaster. Vance knocked on the cabin door. No response. He knocked again, louder, identifying himself as county sheriff. Behind the door, they heard movement. Footsteps. The sound of something heavy being shifted. The door opened 6 inches. A woman's face appeared in the gap, pale and hollow-eyed. Greta Osterfeld looked at the sheriff without recognition, her expression completely blank. "Everything is fine here," she said in heavily accented English. "We don't need help." Vance asked about the mail, about why they hadn't been to town. Greta's response came too quickly, too rehearsed. Wilhelm was sick. The whole family had been sick. They were recovering now. Please leave. Deputy Hollister noticed her hands shaking, noticed the way her eyes kept darting to something behind her inside the cabin. He touched Vance's arm, whispered that something was wrong. "Ma'am, we need to come inside," Vance said firmly. "Just to check on the children. Make sure everyone's all right." Greta's face crumpled. For just a moment, something broke through the mechanical facade. Her mouth opened as if to scream, then closed again. Behind her, a male voice spoke in German, too quiet for the officers to make out the words. Greta straightened, nodded, and stepped back. "You may enter," she said. "But please don't upset the children. What they found inside would haunt both men for the remainder of their lives." The cabin appeared orderly at first. Clean, almost too clean. But the air held a smell that Vance, who'd served in the previous war, recognized immediately. Old blood and something sweeter, more organic. The kind of smell that comes from improper disposal. A man sat at the kitchen table, Ernst's rifle resting across his lap. He wore Ernst's coat and Ernst's boots. He smiled at the officers with perfect calm. "Welcome," he said in accented English. "I am a guest of the Osterfeld family. Would you like coffee?" Hollister's hand moved toward his service revolver. Vance raised his palm slightly, signaling patience. Both men understood instantly they were looking at something far worse than a sick family. The question was how to handle it without causing immediate violence. "Where is Ernst Osterfeld?" Vance asked quietly. Brenner's smile widened. He gestured toward the window, toward the mountains beyond. He went into the snow and didn't come back. Such things happen in winter. The mountains are dangerous, yes? Brenner didn't resist arrest. He set the rifle on the table carefully, stood with his hands visible, and allowed Deputy Hollister to apply handcuffs without protest. His cooperation was more disturbing than violence would have been, suggesting a man who'd already accepted whatever consequences awaited him. The children were found in the cellar, what remained of them. Greta collapsed when the officers opened that door, her body simply folding, as though the last thread holding her together had finally snapped. She was transported to a hospital in Knoxville, where she spent 6 weeks under psychiatric observation before she could speak coherently about what had happened in that cabin. Brenner's interrogation took place in the county jail over 3 days in late March. FBI agents arrived on the second day after military intelligence flagged him as the escaped prisoner from Camp Ashford. The transcripts of these sessions remained classified until 1995, buried in filing cabinets alongside other wartime incidents the government preferred to forget. He spoke calmly throughout, answering questions in careful English, occasionally switching to German when he couldn't find the right words. The interrogators noted his demeanor, relaxed, cooperative, showing no signs of remorse or distress. He described events with the detachment of someone discussing a tactical exercise. "I was starving," he explained on the first day. "In Africa, I saw men die from hunger. It's slow and it's painful, and it destroys your mind before it destroys your body. I decided I would not die that way. When I found the cabin, I made a choice." The agents asked him about Wilhelm. Brenner nodded slowly, as if appreciating their thoroughness. "The boy was necessary. I needed strength to continue. In survival situations, you take what's available. The war taught me this. We did similar things in the desert when supplies failed to arrive. Nobody spoke of it afterward, but we all understood what had been done." Special Agent Morrison asked how he'd lived in the cabin for 2 weeks without anyone escaping or signaling for help. Brenner's response was matter-of-fact. "I controlled the woman through her children. Basic hostage psychology. She was German. She understood efficiency and necessity. After the father was eliminated, resistance became pointless. She knew I would kill them one by one if she didn't cooperate. So, she cooperated. The detail that would later appear in sealed FBI reports came on the third day of questioning, when Agent Morrison asked directly about the smokehouse and cellar. Brenner leaned back in his chair, silent for nearly a minute. When he finally spoke, his words were delivered with chilling precision. "You want to know about the taste. Everyone always wants to know about the taste. I will tell you. It reminded me of home, of Bavaria, of meals my mother prepared when I was young. This surprised me. I expected it to be different, foreign. But it was familiar, comfortable, like returning to something I'd known all my life but had forgotten." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. The young are more tender, less contaminated by hard living. The boy Wilhelm was lean from winter, but still better than what came after. The girl Anna was barely touched. Most of her I preserved properly. The youngest, Johann, was already dying when I used him. Fever makes the meat bitter, I discovered. Not ideal, but necessary, given the circumstances. Morrison had to leave the interrogation room. His report noted he vomited twice before composing himself enough to continue. When he returned, Brenner was writing something on a piece of paper provided by the guard. He slid it across the table. It was a recipe, detailed instructions for proper preservation and preparation, complete with temperature recommendations and timing. At the bottom, written in neat script, "For the historical record," so others understand what survival truly requires. The Army moved quickly once the FBI confirmed Brenner's identity. Within 48 hours of his confession, military police had transferred him from county custody to an undisclosed federal facility. Sheriff Vance received orders to seal all evidence and refer any inquiries to the War Department. The official story became that Ernst Osterfeld and his children had died from exposure during the harsh winter. Tragic, but not uncommon in isolated mountain communities. 5 coffins were prepared at government expense. The bodies, or what remained of them, were transported under military escort to Cumberland National Cemetery in a convoy that traveled only at night. The burial took place on April 2, 1943, attended by 2 Army chaplains, 4 soldiers, and Greta Osterfeld, who stood silent throughout the service before being escorted to a psychiatric facility in Virginia. No headstones identified the graves individually. A single marker listed the family name and the year, nothing more. The plot was located in a remote section of the cemetery, far from the main pathways where visitors might ask questions. The Army's intention was clear: let this family disappear into history as quietly as possible. Brenner's tribunal was conducted entirely in secret. No civilian lawyers, no press, no public record of the proceedings. Military intelligence argued that publicity would damage morale and potentially violate the Geneva Convention's provisions about prisoner treatment. Better to handle it internally, cleanly, without the complications of civilian justice. The tribunal lasted 6 hours. Brenner was permitted to speak in his own defense, though his statement did little to help his case. He maintained that his actions were consistent with survival training, that any soldier in his position would have made similar choices. The tribunal officers listened without expression, then deliberated for 20 minutes, guilty on all counts. Sentence to be carried out immediately. Records declassified during the Cold War revealed that Brenner was executed by firing squad on April 15, 1943, at a military installation in West Virginia. His body was cremated, and the ashes disposed of without ceremony. No death certificate was issued. His family in Bavaria received notification that he had died in custody of natural causes, a lie that spared them the truth, but left them with questions that would never be answered. The cabin in Copper Hollow was burned by order of the county health department in May. Officials cited contamination concerns, though the real reason appeared in classified correspondence. The structure had to be eliminated before curious locals could visit and potentially discover evidence the initial cleanup had missed. The fire burned for 3 days, reducing everything to ash and scorched foundation stones. Greta Osterfeld never recovered. She spent the remaining 2 years of her life institutionalized, unable to speak about what had happened without severe psychological distress. She died in 1945, officially from pneumonia, though staff notes suggested she'd simply stopped eating. She was buried beside her family in Cumberland, the 6th and final grave in that forgotten plot. The case remained buried until 1995, when Cold War document declassification forced the Army to acknowledge what had happened. Historians began piecing together the story from FBI transcripts, military tribunal records, and Brenner's diary, which had been preserved as evidence but never made public. What emerged was a portrait of survival taken to its darkest extreme. A man who'd convinced himself that necessity justified horror, who'd maintained his sanity by abandoning his humanity, who'd eaten a family one by one and claimed it tasted like home. The mountains kept their secrets for 50 years, but eventually, all graves open, all buried truths surface, and the world learns what people are capable of when hunger strips away everything except the will to survive, no matter the cost, no matter whose lives are consumed in the process. If this story disturbed you the way it should, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more cases that expose what humans become when civilization falls away. Because this wasn't the only time hunger turned someone into a monster. There are other stories, darker stories, and we're going to tell every single one of them.